Welcome to the latest paddock pack down after the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix here at Imola, and it was Max Verstappen who took a really important victory for Red Bull today, a very important response after their defeat in Australia. But it was heartbreak for Charles Leclerc and the Tifosi who packed out the grandstands here at Imola, but of course it ended in a really disappointing result for the team. Leclerc was chasing Sergio Perez to try and get second place in the closing stages, pushed a little bit too hard going through the Variante Alta at the top of the hill, and that meant he spun into the wall and almost out of the race. It looked like he was going to be finished. He managed to get it out of the wall, get it back to the pits, and eventually recover to get his way back up to 6th place in the end. And it's not been the weekend that Ferrari would have wanted. There have been a number of factors that have played into why this has been such a difficult weekend for Ferrari, and I think the Tifosi, they would have wanted a lot more. Leclerc came here as the massive championship leader, a long way clear of Max Verstappen at the top of the standings, and while Leclerc and Ferrari are still leading both championships, leaving what is effectively their home Grand Prix, it's still not the result they would have wanted, and those gaps have certainly narrowed quite a bit. Now, the big flashpoint for Ferrari's race was, of course, Charles Leclerc's spin on lap 53. He made the switch to the soft compound tyre. Obviously, in the earlier stages of the race, they'd all started on intermediates. He switched onto the mediums in that sort of switch to the dry phase, had a little bit of a battle with Perez, fell behind, and then couldn't quite close the gap. He had a number of occasions where he got quite close, but it was a couple of seconds between the two of them. Ferrari then decided to roll the dice, brought Leclerc in for another time, even though they told him at one point you can go all the way to the end of the race on this set of mediums. Mattia Binotto explained after the race they felt that was the best opportunity for them to try and catch Perez, and it meant Leclerc that he got the tyres up to temperature quite quickly, was really bearing down on Perez, and he said that he saw a result that at first wasn't there. He thought the third place was really the maximum Ferrari were going to get had they just stayed out all the way to the end, and that meant he pushed a little bit too much. He said himself that he got a bit too greedy, pushed too hard going through that corner, and that in the end resulted in his spin. Now, through that corner all the way through the race, Leclerc had been very quick, and it had been actually quite a weak point for Sergio Perez. We saw in the opening stages that was somewhere that he went straight on at one point, and that had allowed Leclerc to close up on him. And Leclerc said he saw the pace that was there. He knew it was an area he could really gain on Perez, and importantly, it was also a place he had to gain if he wanted to get DRS going onto the main straight as they entered the final double left-hander at Ravazza before then going onto the main straight with DRS. So it was important Leclerc got close there. That's why he was pushing so hard, and he said, look, I did too much, I pushed it a little bit too far. And he said it was actually a bit of a mental thing, that he just wanted it perhaps a little bit too much. And in the end, it's cost him 7 points compared to what a sensible and I think quite comfortable third place would have been. But Ferrari aren't looking to dwell on it. Mattia Binotto said after the race there are no regrets over the strategy. It was definitely the right call to bring Leclerc in another time for those soft tyres, and that was the only way they were going to try and beat Perez today and try and stop Red Bull from getting the 1-2 finish. In the end, though, Leclerc pushed just that little bit too much, and he said it was nothing to do with the pressure. He said it wasn't a case of the home race, the Tifosi cheering him on, of course, but Ferrari said, look, we did everything we could to mitigate the pressure, try and make it easy for the drivers, and ultimately Leclerc said, look, it wasn't a pressure thing, it was just a mental thing. He pushed too hard, and he's vowed to learn from it. We've seen throughout Charles Leclerc's F1 career, he doesn't make the same mistake twice. So I think he'll be very hopeful that at the next race he can learn from this error and bounce back stronger. He is still leading the championship, of course, but this is still a big opportunity missed for Ferrari. But Leclerc was only behind Perez, of course, because of his pretty poor start. And this was a factor that I think when it was wet and it was raining, we were looking on the grid and thinking, well, who's in on the right side of the grid here? And it was very clear, actually, on the side of the grid that Leclerc and both his teammate as well, Carlos Sainz Jr. was on. It was much more slippery, and there was a patch on Leclerc's grid spot that we looked at on the grid, and it was a painted patch, and thought that could cause some issues given how damp it is. I asked Mattia Binotto after the race, have you spoken to the drivers about that start procedure and sort of why they struggled so much? And he said the procedure itself was absolutely fine. It was just a lack of grip, really, that made it so difficult. And it did appear that Leclerc did bog down on the sort of second and third phases of that start. That was what allowed Sergio Perez to get past him, Lando Norris as well. That drops him all the way to 4th for the opening stint of the race, and it meant that by the time he actually passed Norris, he was already 6 seconds behind Verstappen. So it was a lot of ground that Leclerc had to try and make up, and it really didn't help things. And I think that, did they have the outright pace to actually beat Red Bull this weekend? We will get onto that. But that didn't help. It didn't help that he was already so far back. He was already playing catch-up and maybe perhaps wanted it a little bit too much. And that, in the end, didn't go Ferrari's way. Now, Leclerc actually scored Ferrari's only points. Although he had that spin into the wall, it did look at one point that might actually make it a double DNF for Ferrari. Teammate Carlos Sainz Jr., he retired from the race on the opening lap after a clash with Daniel Ricciardo. that was on the run down to the chicane, the Variante Tamburello down at turn 1. And Sainz said that he felt he did absolutely nothing wrong in that. He was on the outside, Ricciardo was on his inside, they were side by side. Ricciardo tried sticking it up the inside, but his wheel touched the curb, and that meant he lost a little bit of grip and started veering in towards Sainz. And Sainz said, look, there was absolutely no way I could have avoided that. And he was very frustrated. He said, obviously, it's very disappointing, particularly after his DNF in Melbourne. But he said the key difference compared to Melbourne was that this is not on him. He said, I can't take any blame for it. And he said, I don't actually feel bad about the result because he's completely blameless. Ricciardo, although the stewards, they didn't investigate it, said no further investigation or action needed. Ricciardo, he put his hands up and said, look, it was me, all on me. He went to Sainz after the race to apologise, and talking to him after the race, he did feel pretty bad, and he said, look, I've had a bad race. Like I've been at the back all race, basically. It's been a bit of an extended test session because of that clash, so his race got impacted, but at least he was in the race. And he said, yeah, it's not as bad as Carlos, whose race effectively ended because of that incident. So yes, certainly not what Ferrari would have wanted, seeing Sainz drop out that early. And it's been a pretty rough period for Carlos Sainz. He obviously had that retirement in Australia. He was very unlucky in qualifying. Then going into the race, said he sort of wasn't very calm, that he was pushing too hard, and that meant that he overworked it, over-egged it, and that resulted in his off in Australia. That obviously meant he retired from the race there. Back-to-back DNFs is not what Sainz wants, but as he said, they are very, very different cases. Ferrari, they said, look, we're not concerned at all about Carlos. We know it's going to come good at some point. We know the pace is there, and these weekends happen. But in the end, it was Red Bull who really did have a pace advantage, and I think we saw that pretty much throughout all the sessions. Apart from Leclerc's stint running in the lead of the sprint race, Verstappen, he looked on top. He was in a really good place all weekend, I think, and we saw that Red Bull was just working the tyres a little bit better no matter what the conditions were. Christian Horner, he spoke after the race and said that it was all about that tyre window. It was how you could get the tyres into sort of that good operating window and really get the most out of them without degradation being too much of an issue. Now, we saw in the sprint race on the soft tyre just how much of an issue degradation was. That's what left Leclerc being such a sitting duck when Verstappen was able to fly past with DRS, and it was a real struggle for him and was powerless, really. Now, although Binotto said it wasn't such an issue on the medium compound tyre that they used in the race, he said that ultimately they still didn't have much of an understanding of it because of the limited practice running. FP1 had been wet, and they only had that 1 hour FP2 session because of the sprint race weekend format. So yeah, it was a weekend that Ferrari just couldn't quite get the most out of their package. But Leclerc said there's reason to be hopeful. He said it's not like we're a massive step behind Red Bull now. And he said it's so close between the two teams, there's no significant gap. So it's probably going to swing back and forth right the way through the season. Mattia Binotto, he sort of teased that there's going to be the major upgrade coming for Ferrari soon. He said it won't be Miami, which of course does point to the Spanish Grand Prix in Barcelona. That has always been the traditional race where teams bring their first major upgrade package of the season. So it might well be that's where we see a bigger step forward for the F175 car from Ferrari. But it is so close between those two teams. I think it's going to really rage on this fight right the way through the season. At the top of the Constructors' Championship, the gap is now just 11 points. Red Bull scored 58 out of a possible 59 points this weekend. It was their first 1-2 finish, believe it or not, since the 2016 Malaysian Grand Prix, which is a really long time ago. Christian Horner, he said after the race, this has to go down as one of our best results in F1 because of the disappointment we had in Australia. We needed to fight back, and we've really done that. And I think we're just really excited about this Verstappen-Leclerc title fight that is hotting up. It is now 2-2 between them for race wins so far this season. It is a 27-point gap between them at the top of the Drivers' Championship. Leclerc obviously still in front. The DNFs have hurt Verstappen very hard. But I think, yeah, this weekend we did see things swing back in Red Bull's favour, back in Verstappen's favour on Ferrari home turf. I think it really sets things up for a very exciting run of races now. We're going to Miami next, a new venue for everybody, so that's going to be a big unknown. But Ferrari, this is not the weekend they would have wanted. I think a lot of factors have really added up to it being a difficult weekend for them, not the home result that would have sent the Tifosi going home very happy tonight. Instead, it is Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing who will be celebrating a well-earned victory, and we'll see if that form can continue when we get to Miami for the inaugural Grand Prix at the Miami International Autodrome in 2 weeks' time.